Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. I'm Maria Volpe. I'm a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, the City University of New York. The CUNY Dispute Resolution Center and the Association for Conflict Resolution of Greater New York are the co-sponsors of this monthly breakfast that I started way back after 9/11 as an opportunity for us to try to figure out ways to be relevant after the tragic attacks on the World Trade Center. This is our 296th gathering. For those of you who are keeping track of where we are in numbers. We used to meet in person, and until April 2020, when the pandemic occurred, we always had bagels and coffee for all of us to gather. Since April 2020, we've been running this online version, and we record them. All of the recordings are posted on our YouTube channel. And Nikki, if you could put that in the chat. They're also posted on the ACRGNY and the CUNY DRC websites. These breakfasts are made possible every month by an amazing group of individuals, including Matthew Latimer, Nikki Borofsky, Chloe Choi, Sherston Pugh, and our newest addition, Alex Yaroslavsky. Welcome, Alex, as a co-facilitator of this monthly gathering. We are incredibly fortunate to have such wonderful colleagues who join us each month to share their work, their publications, their research. And this morning, we are so delighted to have you with us, Josh Weiss. I'm going to turn it over to Nikki Borofsky, who will introduce Josh. Thanks again, Josh, for being here with us. We look forward to your comments this morning.
Thanks, it's my
Nikki, take it
pleasure.
away.
Thank you, Maria. And just as I'm beginning, I'm getting an unstable internet notice on my computer. So I hope you can all hear me, and I hope this works. But as we were talking before, we're leaning into failure and everything that we can learn from it. So welcome to everybody. Today's speaker, as Maria hinted, brings a real clarity and comprehensiveness to negotiation that's pretty rare, not just because of his deep credentials, but because he asks the toughest questions. What do we do when the table goes silent? What do we do when talks slow or stall or parties completely walk away? What do we do when a negotiation fails? Dr. Joshua N. Weiss is co-founder of the Global Negotiation Initiative at Harvard University, created with William Ury, half of the seminal Getting to Yes duo with Roger Fisher. Dr. Weiss is a senior fellow at the Harvard Negotiation Project, and he directs the MS in Leadership and Negotiation at Bay Path University. He earned his Ph.D. at the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason, and he spent his career counseling, teaching, writing, and practicing across sectors, including work with FEMA, the State Department, the United Nations, Microsoft, Deloitte, and a ton of other companies across sectors. He's been a leader also in using media and technology to broaden the reach of negotiation practice. His Negotiation Tip of the Week podcast drew over 2 million downloads back when podcasts were still fresh and new. And his Negotiator in You audio and ebook series has made negotiation skills accessible beyond boardrooms and classrooms and breaking through the echo chamber that we're sometimes seeking to break here. He's even written a trilogy of children's books, Emo and Chicky, that introduce negotiation and conflict skills through story. And these books have been praised by luminaries from Ken Cloak to the Dalai Lama. So we know they're good. We were just talking before about how he's walked the Abraham path through the Middle East. Really, anybody who connects, works, or mediates from behind a screen, and that's everybody here, should also check out Dr. Weiss's TED Talk, The Wired Negotiator, where he explores how tech is reshaping the way we communicate and influence each other. It is direct, practical, speaks to the world we're navigating now, and really is a thoughtful, interesting, fun nugget to share that might inspire you to change your outlook on an imposed modality of communications. But what brings us today to the roundtable with Dr. Weiss is his newest book, Getting Back to the Table, 5 Steps to Reviving Stalled Negotiations. This is not another how to win manual. It is a framework, a really thoughtful framework for how we reflect, learn, and return when negotiations fall apart. It identifies 7 distinct types of failure, even the ones we want to try to forget, and walks us through how we analyze what went wrong, unlearn what isn't helping, and get back to the table with something wiser than just a new tactic. For this audience, mediators, facilitators, dialogue practitioners, and conflict resolvers, this is essential territory. Negotiation isn't a separate skill. It is really baked into everything we do. And our ability to recover from breakdown, failure, hopelessness, which seems to abound of late in lots of places in the world, with thoughtfulness and intentionality, this is often what separates resolution from mere retreat. So today's session is an invitation to take failure seriously, not as something to avoid, but as one of our richest sources of insight. Please join me in welcoming Josh Weiss to the roundtable.
Wow, Nikki, I'm speechless. That was lovely. Thank you so much. Um, it is a real pleasure to be with everybody this morning, at least this morning where I am, and I very much appreciate you taking time out of your schedules. I mean, some of you in on the West Coast are, thank you for getting up so early. It's really an honor to be with everybody. And as Nikki said, I've been sort of trying to dive into different realms that I think when I look out at the landscape and wonder, what are we saying to people about this? Um, and sometimes the answer is not much. And so for me, that's fertile territory to say, well, why not say something and see what happens? And to dive into these realms. So, um, listen, when I was in university, I never loved lectures. I much prefer talking and engaging and dialoguing about these things. So I'm going to try to share with you the essence of the book in a 30, 45 minute period. But along the way, I'm going to pause and see what kind of comments or questions that you have, because there are 5 steps to this framework, and waiting till the end feels like a lot to me. Um, so we'll do that. And then honestly, I'm really very happy to open it up and have more of a conversation because for better or worse, we've all been at the place that I'm going to talk about today where things haven't worked out. Right. And I think in the end, the question is, what do we do about that? And so that was really the goal, was to sort of explore this notion of setbacks and failures and how do we really learn from it. And I know there are a lot of coaches and trainers out there as well on the line, and I'm sure, like me, people come up to you often and say, this happened, what could I have done differently? Or and so I think it's on people's minds, and I think in some way I felt like there's an obligation amongst all of us to sort of grapple with this and how do we really learn from it. And honestly, it was interesting. As I would talk to people, I would find that they weren't really learning the right lessons until they started to dig in. They think they do, but but what I found is when I started to nudge them a little bit and say, why do you really think that? Or why do you think that was the core lesson here? They hadn't really dug into it. And so I thought, let me see if I can give people a process to kind of really try to understand what happened. And as you will notice, it's very much focused on you as a negotiator. And the more trainings that I do, I'm finding that I'm actually spending a lot more time discussing the psychological dimensions of negotiation than it is simply the tactics and how to work with difficult people and things like that, because so much of what we do begins between our ears and sometimes stays between our ears in an unhelpful way. So let me pop up some slides just to give you something to look at other than me, which is a treat for all of you. Um, oops, let's see here. Can everybody see that okay? Got it. Perfect. Okay. Um, so let me just begin by saying a little bit, another word or two about why did I do this. So I happened to be at a kind of a small conference on negotiation um, a few years ago, and a woman came up to me, and I wrote a book in 2020 called The Book of Real World Negotiations, which was essentially a book of case studies. I got to a point in my life where I felt like a lot of people didn't really understand what I think we all understand, which is what effective negotiation really looks like. There were narratives and stories that were getting in the way. And I thought, instead of telling people, because people don't generally like to be told, I thought I would just show them. And so I put together this book that really tried to lay out a number of real world cases to help people to see what that all looked like. And this woman came up to me and we started talking and she said, "Oh, I read your book. It was quite good. Thank you. But I have a question. Why did you focus on successes?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, I don't know about you, but I've learned a whole lot more about fail from my failures. And so would you ever consider doing something on that?" And I said, "Well, let me think about it." Um, and then I sort of left it for a little bit and started to probe it actually and to look at what was out there when it came to what do we do when, negotiations don't work and don't get us where we want to go. And if I fast forward a bit, I was talking to a student and she said, "Well, I'm curious, Professor, what are you working on now?" And I said, "Well, I'm actually working on a book about setbacks and failures in negotiation and how to try to really learn from it and deal with it." And she said, "Oh, thank goodness." And I said, "Well, why would you say that?" And she said, "Because I feel like all we read are about successes. And if we aren't succeeding all the time, it makes us feel like we're bad negotiators." And that really stopped me in my tracks. And I thought, if this is the message that people who are trying to learn all of this is getting, then that's actually really problematic. We want people to have a realistic understanding of what negotiation is and what it looks like. And so I I suppose I want to say that part of what I was trying to do was to recognize that setbacks and failures are part of the negotiation landscape. And we need to just say that's the deal. Like, we are not going to succeed every time. And frankly, if you've succeeded every time, you're not really engaging in very challenging negotiations. Um, so, and then, but I also wanted to do a couple of other things, as you can see on your screen. One was to kind of create awareness about the different ways that negotiators can fail. And I've come up with 7 of them. Now, there may be other ways in which we can fail. I never put it past human beings to do extraordinary things. But what I was trying to do was say, look, keep an eye out for these because if you know they're there, whoops, sorry. If you know they're there, then it's much easier to avoid them and to make sure that you don't fall into that trap. And so, but I was hoping also to really, again, get people to think, well, are there other ways to fail? And actually, my publisher, and I would highly recommend my publisher on this book called Barrett Kohler. They're a small publisher out in San Francisco, but they treated this project like I would have wanted them to treat it. It was wonderful. And I my previous book was with Wiley, and I was a little more of a number there. But with Barrett Kohler, they were really great, and they sent out my manuscript to 5 CEOs of companies that were not in the negotiation world, and said, "Please read this." And one of the bits of feedback was from somebody who said, "I really like the idea of categorizing these failures, but can you give them names so that we can remember them a bit better?" So I've tried to do a little bit of that as well, just for fun, and to give people that opportunity. Again, to really the purpose here is to broaden and deepen the conversation about failure. I'm clearly not the last word on this. There is a lot to be said, and I've been really grateful to see that people are sort of grappling with this now in a good way. Um, One of the interesting things, some of you may know a friend of mine named Kwame Christian, who has a great podcast called Negotiate Anything. If you don't, I would highly recommend it. Um, and he interviewed me about the book, and at the end of it, he said, I think part of what you're trying to do here is separate shame from failure. You're trying to tell people it's okay, like this is going to happen, and don't beat yourself up about it. Take the time to learn about it. And I think I mean, maybe that wasn't my intention, but I really like that. So I'm going to use it going forward because I think it is a really important part of this. We are our own worst enemies when it comes to our failures. We beat ourselves up in a way that other people don't. And so good to, if you can really learn to say, okay, this happened. It's certainly a setback or it's certainly a failure. How can I really take the best away from all of this, so that I can manage this going forward. And ultimately, to be honest, the goal is to become a better negotiator in the end, right? And so, but like I said, the last piece of this was really to help people learn about those setbacks and failures, so that they become better at their craft. And that's, to me, this is a journey. This isn't a destination, right? We don't get to be great negotiators and declare that. We're always learning something new. And frankly, that's what I love about the field. And I'm guessing it is for you too. Now, when I started to get into this, I realized that there were three typical responses to failure. And those responses, I couched in the fairy tale of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. I'm hoping everybody knows that story. If it's foreign to you, very briefly, this little girl wanders into the woods, gets lost, and ends up at a house. And she wanders into the house, and there are three bowls of porridge on the table. And the first bowl of porridge, or oatmeal, is too hot. And that analogously for me was about how people rationalize their failures and their behaviors. And so when we fail, what we often seek to do, because part of our desire as human beings is to protect our reputation, we rationalize what happened. We basically say this had to be as a result of what. But the bottom line is we protect our ego, we protect ourself. Despite the fact that we were part of the failure, we find a way to say, this was because of the other or the circumstances. That's not too helpful. I say pretty clearly in the book, blame really serves no purpose when it comes to all of this. Responsibility serves a purpose. It's important for us to own the things that we did that perhaps took a negotiation down the wrong road or things along those lines. That's different than blame. Blame is, again, putting the onus on other people and not learning. We can't learn a whole lot when we blame others, right? So that's the first typical response. The second typical response is that we experience anxiety. That's approach, right? We fail. It's a really difficult scenario. It's painful. And so if we negotiate again, we have a lot of anxiety when it comes to all of that. And frankly, a lot of people don't want to negotiate. I'm sure those of you who talk to folks on a regular basis know that when people have a bad experience, it can really cloud their whole approach to negotiation, and they bring those experiences into upcoming negotiations. And so it becomes an anxiety-filled experience. Again, very hard to learn when you have anxiety, right? It's difficult. It stops us from really thinking about what happened, etc. The last bowl of porridge is the just right one. It's not too hot, it's not too cold. And for me, that's learning that if you can go through this process and say, okay, in the end, um, here's what I really took away. And I can see how this is going to make me a better negotiator in the end. And that's what we're aiming for. And that's what the framework that I've put together sort of tries to lead you through a bit of a process to really understand what happened and to either get back to the table, or if getting back to the table isn't possible, then really learning and becoming a better negotiator as a result. So let me just give you a couple of examples. So I tried to start the book with helping people to understand there are different kinds of failures. Now, I didn't want to go through all seven of them because that takes a long time, but I'll share three of them with you. And the others are, of course, in the book and easily accessible. There's probably an AI summary somewhere already, so I don't doubt it. Um, so let me just share a couple of these with you to give you an idea of what I mean. And I think I noticed in the chat, what does success mean when it comes to negotiation? And for me, success actually is whether you met your objectives as best as possible in your negotiation. And so if success is not about reaching agreement. I firmly believe that. I think, as you all know, as mediators and others working in this world, we can reach agreements and they can fall apart 2 days later. That's not success. These processes are about achieving the objectives that we have when we begin these processes. We have a goal, right? And if we don't achieve that goal, then that's either a significant setback or a failure. So the first type of failure, to give you an idea of what these look like, is something that I called, thanks to my CEO friend who said, please give these names, the slipping through your fingers failure. And what that meant was that basically when you're negotiating, and it looks as if actually you and the other side have all the reason to reach an agreement, and yet something happens and you don't. And again, an agreement that really meets your objectives as best as possible. And so I call that sort of slipping through your fingers because, there's a solution, there's a way forward that is clearly beneficial, meets your goals and objectives, and yet it somehow slips through your fingers. Um, and in that case, I would call that a failure where you had a really good opportunity to advance your objective. And for some reason, sometimes it's the intangibles. In negotiation, I often separate interests into tangible and intangible interests. And obviously, tangible are the things we can touch, like budgets and money and land and things along those lines. And the intangible are the things that make us human. If someone feels disrespected, things along those lines. And that is often what's underpinning the slip through your fingers failure. Okay. Then there's the what were you thinking failure. So the what were you thinking failure is actually when we agree to something that doesn't meet our objectives. In some ways, we agree to a solution or a way forward because we think that our job is to reach agreement in a negotiation. But like I said, there are a lot of bad agreements that don't really meet our objectives. And if we go down that road, I would consider that a failure, especially the way that I'm defining it, right? And so, history is littered with bad agreements. This is why I'm not a big fan of compromise, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But I think there are a lot of compromise agreements based on compromise that don't meet our objectives, and frankly, are often worse than our best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So that's another kind of failure, reaching an agreement that really doesn't meet your goals or objectives very well. And then the third one that I'll mention is the penny wise and pound foolish failure. So penny wise and pound foolish really means that you accept perhaps a bigger amount in the near term at the expense of the long term. And in negotiation in general, that means the long term means the relationship. That, for example, if you know that you're going to be negotiating with the same person or the same organization, and you try to squeeze something out of them from a negotiation point of view, but you damage the relationship, To me, that's a failure because you've now made your life harder, and you've damaged a valuable relationship that you're going to need going forward. Okay. So, like I said, those are three. And the goal with this and creating a little bit of a taxonomy is just to give people a sense of what to look out for and to be thinking about. And, if you do happen to get a copy of the book or whatever, and you can think of another one, I'd love to hear from you. And I'm sure there are probably some more out there that can be called out as part of this process. So let me just say one more thing, and then I think I'll pause and see if I wasn't looking at the comments as closely as I should, but I will uh, go back and maybe Nikki, if there are some in there that you want to pull out for me before I keep going after this slide, I'll do that. So let me just go back to something and just be clear about why I think that we don't learn from our failures. I've mentioned one of them so far, which is the blame and rationalization piece, right? Like that when that happens, we're not taking in anything really of any substance, and we cannot learn. But the second one, the second reason that I see people not learning is due to the biases that we have. So, for those of you interested in the psychological realm, I don't need to tell you all of the biases that impact our way of thinking and our decision making. Um, Self-serving bias, where again, we're protecting our ego, the backfire effect, where, when we take a position and somebody challenges it, instead of re-examining our position or our perspective on something, we double down. We reinforce that perspective even more because if we come off of it again, it reflects poorly on our ego. Um, and then I would also say that human beings, um, as we learn from Kahneman and Tversky, have a tendency toward loss aversion, right? That if this goes all the way back to hunter-gatherers, right? If we lost back then, we got eaten, which was not a very optimistic proposition, right? So we learned to protect ourselves. And as a result, taking a defensive posture is, for most people, their default, right? From an instinctual point of view, that's what we do. And when we get into a posture where we're trying to avoid loss, we can't learn. It's difficult to learn because we're just not taking in new information. We're not open. We're not curious. We're not asking why. We're thinking, how do I protect myself at this moment? And the other one that I uncovered that I thought was really interesting from my point of view, at least, was this idea of heuristics and heuristics simply are really kind of boils down to the idea of mental shortcuts. And we create mental shortcuts all the time to get through the day. It's a perfectly normal and reasonable thing to do. But heuristics can lead us astray, right? If I think that I um, had a success in a negotiation, um, and I can now take that approach and apply it to all of my negotiations, that's a way in which heuristics can really lead us astray. Because in the book, I talk about a woman named Catherine Bartol, who is a professor at the University of Maryland. And I came across her quote, and it really stopped me in my tracks. It said, um, when you've seen one negotiation, you've seen one negotiation. And what I really liked about that wasn't that there isn't transferability from negotiation to negotiation, because there certainly is at times. But what it does is it helps you to remember that there's also uniqueness to each negotiation that we engage in. And so we have to be very careful about applying our lessons from one negotiation to another. And it really takes some thought and some deciphering as to whether certain lessons are applicable or not as part of this. So, um, Nikki, any questions that I did see the one around success?
There
I
was
don't
the
think.
one around success. A couple people have DM'd me. They wanted the full list, and I put up the article that you wrote for Harvard Business
Ah,
Review that punches them out.
okay.
But we just got a few more. One of the hardest, Tina writes, she mediates a lot of employment law cases. One of the hardest challenges
Hmm.
she experiences is parents of disabled adults engaging in the mediation process. Can you talk about how you would get the parents to be open-minded and not defensive?
Wow, that's a good
I
question.
don't know. That's a tough question.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, in my own mediations where some of that's happened, or I've had parents or others involved, I have to first. I think the first thing you have to do is remind yourself where they're coming from. That they are trying to advocate for somebody, and to see what it is that they're doing from that vantage point, and to help them to understand that that's what, your goal in the end is to help them to meet that, which is why you're there and why you're helping them. So, it's interesting. Like when I deal with difficult people, the I always reframe what I'm doing with them and say, what are they afraid of? And I think when we couch things in fear, that people are afraid of certain things, it absolutely helps us to empathize in a way that might otherwise be difficult. So that's another sort of strategy that I've tried to utilize, is to sort of, because we're all afraid of things. Like it's what motivates us much of the time, honestly, I think. And so if you can put into your repertoire, the reframing of what are they afraid of? What are they trying to protect as part of this process? It makes it easier to try to manage when they are being difficult. As the father of three daughters who, and a lot of them played sports, I was always astonished at the parents, and how that process unfolded. So that would be one small piece of advice, for you. Nikki, any others to pick up on?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's one from Taurus asking, how do we separate our failures from the failures of our clients?
Well, first of all, look, one of the things that I've noticed is when I share my own failures, it really seems to help others, not because it's, some great epiphany, but because sometimes I think people look at you and say, "Oh, that person doesn't fail," and it's like, yes, we do. Um, I was actually a pretty average kid and failed a lot as a child. And so I learned how to fail in a way that I actually think has been incredibly helpful for me over the course of my career, mostly because I'm not afraid to try things and to see what happens. And that doesn't mean that that's exceptionally or unique, but I think, let me put it this way. I have a lot of friends who I will say, "Hey, here's this really interesting project. Do you want to work on it with me?" And they'll say, "No, I'm just an Eastern European specialist or whatever." And I'm like, "Well, I understand, um, but like, why not give it a shot? The worst thing that can happen is it doesn't work out." And, and we learn something, from it all. So, um, I think I would say, I mean, and maybe to your point, as well, about, you know, I think I'm wondering if the question is about, you know, was it you that led them astray on some level, or was it the client that was just being very challenging? And I think in that instance, I would say that no matter what we do, whatever the circumstances are that we find ourselves in, we contributed to it. And I think, and somebody, I think it might have been John from Oneonta, was talking about reading difficult conversations. In that book, they talk about the what happened conversation. And um, and I think that's a very productive thing to do when some kind of failure happens or setback happens, is to ask, what was my contribution? Not because you know, again, not out of blame, but out of, if I had asked a different question, maybe my client would have landed somewhere else, right? And that's the learning for us, that I think is important to do, is to say, what did I contribute? Because if you're part of the process in some way, shape, or form, whether you say something or you say nothing, you're contributing, right? So I think that's one way of trying to understand what you were getting at, Tara, there. Um, yeah.
I want to let you continue because I know there's still a lot and there's still a
Okay.
few questions that are
Okay.
out there that I haven't asked. So I apologize to those people but hopefully there'll be a little bit of
Yeah.
balance at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So let me, like I said, I'd really love to just give you the high level view here of the process that I laid out. Obviously, there's more to dig into, but give you a sense of what this looks like. And then, I will pause if there's, and maybe take a question or two along the way. But then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for a broader conversation. So, sorry, the first step here is this notion of you failed and accepting it. So why, you might be wondering, well, why is that so important? And I think from my point of view, the reason this is so important is because denial is the first thing that we do when this happens. We refuse to accept that maybe this didn't work out. Maybe we're not going to meet our objectives here. And we can't really, what I think one of the things that I've seen is it's very hard to learn when we stay rooted in denial or, in blame of the other. And when we accept that we failed or we've had this significant setback and we've got to figure out what to do with it, then we're really owning it and we're saying, okay, like it's normal for me to be really disappointed that I didn't get what I wanted. But there's a curve, and some of you have seen the curve of acceptance from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and there are a lot of people who have been very critical of this process that she laid out. And again, if you're not familiar, she laid this out initially to help explain when people experience very negative news. And in fact, the original notion was that they learn that they end up having a terminal illness of some kind, and how do they cope with that? But this process has been applied to other things like, again, not achieving your objective. And if you can learn to accept that notion, then you sort of unblock yourself for the rest of the process. Um, in the book, I use the analogy of sort of a backed up sink, right? When a sink is backed up, no water gets through. And that feels to me like what happens to human beings when we fail is nothing gets through until we've really accepted that this didn't work out and it's not the end of the world. It's frustrating, it's difficult, it might be embarrassing, etc. But I have to come to grips with that, right? So again, in the book, I share, and I added to be very clear, I added the second step in this, because Kubler-Ross begins with denial and then goes to anger, sadness, acceptance, and problem solving is what she said generally how people go through this process. I added anxiety after denial because that's typically what I really see is that when somebody moves out of denial, they start to realize that this is real and they start to feel anxious because they didn't get what they were trying to achieve. Now, the one thing where I do disagree with Kubler-Ross is I don't believe everybody goes through all of these stages. My own sense is that, when these kinds of things happens, I experience denial, and some anxiety, but I don't really get into like anger is not what washes over me. I typically feel sad or disappointed and then eventually get to acceptance and problem solving. So I think there's something to work with when it comes to this curve. And I think it's important to recognize that not everybody goes through all of these steps, and that's okay. And that's perfectly fine. I think the most important thing is what's going to get you to a place where you can say, this happened. It's not what I wanted, but I'm going to accept it so that I can now really understand what happened. Okay, so, and this is in some way, this is really the emotional part of the process. And, when I was doing this, I was remembering something that George Mitchell said when he was mediating in Northern Ireland, where he would start the sessions in the morning with the parties with effectively what he called a rant session, where he gave people the opportunity to rant about anything they wanted to say, so that they could process the emotional parts of what they were doing and then move into thinking clearly and sort of problem solving. And in some way, I would say try to think about this in that way of accepting it and saying and feeling the disappointment. I use the word, that we might feel a bit of grief, and that might be a bit strong, but But I do think that, especially if a negotiation is really important to us, which we engage in a lot of important negotiations, if we don't get where we want to go, we do feel that kind of grief. We feel a deep sense of loss for not achieving our goal that we had our heart set on. And so, if we're really being honest, this is what happens to us: is that we feel a deep sense of disappointment, and we have to accept it in order to figure out what we did. Okay. Um, So any quick questions on that one, Nikki, in particular, just in terms of the idea of accepting it before I forge ahead?
I don't think that there are questions precisely on that point.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, let's hang on to the other ones that are there, and then we can use those to open up at the end of this. So when you've accepted this, and again, like I said, think emotions here. And I'm somebody who believes deeply that emotions always play a role in these processes. And the notion that they don't is, to be honest, from my point of view, is kind of dangerous because human beings are logical and emotional creatures. And if I told you, let's keep logic out of the process, you would be like, yep, why are we listening to this person? And that's my experience when we say, let's keep emotions out. And I think books like, Beyond Reason and others, and all of the work on emotional intelligence tell us that, hey, we've got to understand and realize that emotions are going to play an important role in all of this, expressed or unexpressed, right? Even if they're not expressed, they're still there. You're still frustrated, you're still angry. And there's almost no way to go through these processes without having that experience, right? So that's the first part, is sort of managing the emotional piece of this and coming to grips with a new reality that's in front of you, right? Or beginning to emerge in front of you. The second step is the analysis piece. And I talk about the forest and trees and what went wrong. And the reason that I do this is because, as I was mentioning before, I do a good bit of training, whether it's with governments or companies or nonprofits or whatever it is. And when people have come to me at lunch or after and said, "Can you help me to understand what transpired in this negotiation?" What I'm finding with a lot of folks is that they're not doing a deep analysis. They're doing a very cursory kind of thing. Like, I'm sure you've all heard the saying, experience is a good teacher. And it's only a good teacher if we really take the time to figure out what actually happened, because things too often look like something and we just accept it without actually really digging in and wondering more deeply about, did I get my analysis right here? Right. And we all know that if we don't analyze something properly, we can't diagnose the solution. So the forest, in my mind, is obviously the big picture, but it's those 7 types of failures. And so, if you can say, okay, so which type of failure does mine fit into? And the other thing that I forgot to mention is that I sort of created a little bit of a scale. So once you know about the 7 types of failures, then the biggest question that people typically have is, well, how bad is it? Can I get back to the table? And so I created a magnitude scale, think earthquake, if you will. And the number one on it's a 4-point scale. Number one is the least harmful, right? That you had a setback, but you can clearly see a way forward. Uh, and so the magnitude of the problem was not too bad. Um, a 4, on the other hand, is where you genuinely failed and you cannot see a way back to the table, at least in the near term. Okay. So I think it's valuable to say, what type of failure do I have? And then how bad was it in the big picture analysis? And then when it comes to the trees, I borrowed a concept from Debbie Kolb and in her book on the shadow negotiation about the moves and turns and critical moments of a negotiation process. And what I'm really trying to encourage people to do is to look at, more specifically, um, break the negotiation down, or the mediation, or whatever it is that you're doing, to the specifics of where you really think things started to unravel, or where things took a downward turn. right? Can you pinpoint the moves and turns that happen? Can you pinpoint, a critical moment where somebody did something and you responded and they were offended and that was the end. Like you could never really recover. And I think by doing that, it helps you to not only understand that, but then think to yourself, what else could I have done in that instance, right? And that's where the learning begins to come in is what else could I have said or done to redirect the process down a different road? And of course, hindsight is always valuable when it comes to these things, but what I'm trying to do is get at this back and forth, and it I think goes back to Tara's question a little bit before as well. This is about the contribution that you made, and it's just that this is how the process unfolded. And I think being able to pinpoint where did something go wrong, and really take you down a road you didn't want to go is valuable because, again, we learn to recognize those things. And maybe instead of saying something in the moment, we pause and go to the balcony and think of a better approach, a better strategy to utilize, than just saying the first thing that comes to mind. Okay. Anything about the analysis part? And again, I realize I'm being brief. I just, want to save time um, to have more of a conversation about some of these things.
I mean, on a kind of overall analysis, and I don't know if this is directly to this point, but there
Yeah.
was a question earlier about how to apply the analysis to a really big international crisis like the Ukraine-Russia negotiations in Abu Dhabi right now. How
Yeah.
how would you apply this theory to a complex situation like this? And I know you've worked in a lot of different
Yeah.
international contexts.
Yeah, and I do think, I mean, to be very candid, I can think of a number of the processes that I was involved in where, um, I mean, first of all, in that context, by the way, failure is the norm. It's not the exception. Um, and but in the end, and if we look at a place like Northern Ireland, or there are some folks in Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian, I mean, it's a series of processes, right? Most of which have failed, but many of which people have taken nuggets from. They've said, this is a valuable dimension that was discussed in this process that we can bring to the forefront. But I do think even in those complicated situations, we can pinpoint where things didn't go well and where things broke down. Um, it's a little bit more of a complicated analysis, but it's not actually that hard. Much of the time, I feel like those kinds of things rise to the surface pretty clearly, and you could say, yeah, this was the pivotal moment. This was the critical moment in that negotiation, and how we tried to address it, missed the mark. Um, Sorry, I just saw one other quick question. Let me, from
Yeah.
John, how would you work the analysis to expose implicit biases when you're evaluating yourself? Yeah, so I think it's a great question, John. I mean, the first thing that I would say is that um, so much of this is about awareness, right? I think there are a lot of folks who aren't aware of their implicit biases. And so, like, if I can recall a time where I was working with somebody and they were laying out what they learned and what happened in the process, and much of it was, the other person did this, the other person did that, and I said, "Listen, I'm curious, like, what did you do here?" And he kind of looked at me like, "What do you mean?" Um, and I said, "Look, there's a contribution here from you, and I need you to really dig into that." And he had a self-serving bias, and I said, "This is part of what you're grappling with is that you're not owning some of the things that you did here, and if you really want to take something away, you're going to have to do that." Um, so part of it is helping people to, uh, first of all, become aware of their implicit biases. We all have them. Um, and so, in the book, I lay out a handful of them for people to be aware of, and there are obviously others. But um, just like, the seven kinds of failure is an awareness thing, um, so are, the implicit biases and how those impact. But you've got to dig deep and look in the mirror. Um, and it was interesting. I had a conversation with somebody on LinkedIn because I posted, I think, about my book or another book, and they wrote back and they said, "Do you really think that you can learn to negotiate through a book?" And I said, "Well, I said, usually to me, there are two ways of learning. One is experience, right? That you get in there and roll up your sleeves and do it. And the other is awareness. And how do you develop awareness about anything? Well, it's learning. And so I think they go hand in hand in a very useful kind of way. And I do believe it's really important to kind of um, to make sure that we're aware of a lot of these things instead of just sort of fumbling through how we deal with things. The more aware we are, the more we can also manage that and deal with those kinds of things.
Have you done on that point? Have you done any analysis on the actual numbers, the cost benefit of learning or refusing to learn from individual or collective failures?
I
That was a question from before.
I have not done any research on that, but that would be a very good next step for sure.
For your pitch deck.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, so let me see if there's any other. Also, do the analysis when things go well. Absolutely, I agree. I mean, and I think there's more of a tendency. I mean, I think you've all probably had the experience of talking to people, and people love to tell you about their successes. But I think to your point, Verilyn, even then, if it's not an examined experience, our learning is kind of limited. We really have to um, we have to dive deeply, whether it's a success, a failure, or somewhere in between, to really understand, what's in front of us. So let me go ahead and go into the next couple steps here, and then we can, like I said, open it up. So the third step is not learning just any lessons, but the right ones. And this one is has been interesting from my point of view to talk to people about. And I think it comes down to this. The quote by John Maxwell, I think, is at the heart of it. Experience is not the best teacher, evaluated experiences. I can't tell you how many times I've been, again, doing trainings or coaching or whatever it is, and somebody will discuss a negotiation and then say, that was such an important experience. And I'll sort of look at them like, I'm not sure I understand what you really took away from this in the way that you're talking about. And to really learn the right lessons from a negotiation, we have to ask this question: what are the similarities and differences? You know, um, Recently, a month ago, I was doing a training with a group of engineers, and a guy came up to me and said, I have this upcoming negotiation, can you help me to think it through? And I said, sure. So we started to have lunch and talk. And he was explaining how he had had a negotiation with it a few weeks back and had success, and that his thinking was to do the same thing in an upcoming negotiation. And I said, well, maybe that's some good thinking, but tell me about the previous negotiation. What did it look like? Was it, how many parties were there? What were the dynamics involved, et cetera, et cetera. And when we went through that, and I said, okay, so then what are the similarities in this upcoming negotiation? And he said, well, actually, in that first negotiation, it was me and one other person. And in this other one, it's going to be me and a team of people on our side and a team on the other. And I said, okay, so you're going to have to manage that, which was a dynamic that was not part of the first negotiation. And I said, what about the power differential? And he said, well, in the first one, there really wasn't a power differential. In this one, they actually kind of hold the cards. I said, okay. So the more we went through that, and after about 20 minutes, he looked at me and he said, I'm beginning to think that I might not want to apply what I had done the last time to this upcoming negotiation because there's too many things that are different. And I said, now you got it. Like, that's exactly right, because there were so many dimensions to that previous negotiation that didn't actually sync up to this one coming up. And this is where I think I go back to the point that Bartol made, right? Where we really have to bring a discerning eye to our situations and be careful about um, the lessons that we're going to transfer from one negotiation to another, because um, we often do that. When we have a success, we think, okay, so now I have a pretty good formula. Let me just do that again. And that's when we run into problems. This is where sort of heuristics and other kinds of things um, kind of short circuit, if you will, maybe a better approach because we think we can just use that approach from the past. And so, I think it's really key to be lining up the negotiations next to each other and asking what are the similarities and are there lessons I can learn from this one going forward, or do I have to be careful? Because what I found is sort of the last bullet point. It's easy to learn the wrong lessons unless you're really examining things in great detail. And when we do that, it leads us astray, right? It leads us down a road that we don't want to go and that honestly isn't going to help us. It's going to give us a false sense of comfort. So for me, it's really about learning the right lessons, not just any lesson from your negotiations and thinking clearly about how they apply to an upcoming process or not, or how they might apply to getting back to the table, right? If I think that there's a way to get back to the table from the previous process, I want to make sure that I'm taking away certain things that will be helpful going forward, and I'm not bringing forward some of the things that actually caused the problem in the first place. And that notion leads me to probably the hardest step of the process, which is to actively unlearn what your weakness has taught you. So there's a sort of a great quote by Peter Drucker, who basically said, the management guru, who said, if you want to learn something new, you have to unlearn something old. And, when I read that, I thought, I think this is really what's happening to people is that we are bringing to our processes um, concepts and ideas that we've learned about how to negotiate, for example. And we've never really examined those. We haven't said, is this the best approach? Is this the best way? Where did I learn to do this? A lot of times when I'm sitting with somebody that I'm coaching or working with, and I'll say, so why do you think that's the best approach in this negotiation? Often it will be, well, I've always done it, or I learned it this way, or somebody once told me that lesson, or something along those lines. And what I find actually is that a lot of the things, you know, I'm guessing for many of you, when read things in the media, particularly about mediation or negotiation or conflict resolution in general, it's probably a frustrating experience for you because I know it is for me because I feel like the things that um, the media tells you about what effective negotiation looks like, for example, is not what I believe is effective negotiation. And in fact, I genuinely think that it's getting in the way. It gets in most people's way, and is actually sort of thinking that is old and tired and needs to be replaced with better ways of thinking and doing. And so what I've tried to get at here is to kind of nudge people to think, what are the core principles of your approach to negotiation and why, right? And is it possible that those things are leading you astray? Is it possible that they're actually the reason why you might have failed? And that if that's the case, then you might want to think maybe this stuff is dated and maybe I need to learn a new way of thinking about negotiation. And that the example that I pick up on and that I try to work with quite a bit is the whole notion of compromise. So I'm just not a huge fan. I know compromise sometimes is necessary, but typically what I experience with most people is that they think it's always part of a negotiation process. And frankly, it's part of the reason why most people don't like to negotiate because they think they have to give up something of great value in order um, to reach agreement. And for me, that's not productive. And they also do it in a way where they don't really explore. Like when things get difficult, people immediately rush to split the difference or compromise or something along those lines. And they don't even really understand what's driving the parties from an interest-based point of view or whatever it might be, right? And so in the book, I try to sort of say, you might want to think about whether compromise is really serving you well, or whether you could try to shift, for example, to problem solving and to take that approach and that way of thinking and see where it gets you. And so I'm trying to get people to think about what are the things that you see as the core tenets of your approach to negotiation, and are those really serving you in the way that you hope they would, right? And so that means examining, kind of deeply, and having to let go of certain things, and seek to adopt a new way of doing things. And then I've written a good bit on, just again, kind of for fun, like when I have some thoughts about things, I like to put them in short articles on LinkedIn and see what people have to say. And so I've now written a couple things on compromise, of when you should do it and when you shouldn't, but also views on compromise. There are some very interesting views around the world about what compromise means. And I use a particular definition here, but there are other places around the world where compromise means something very different, right? And so it's important for people to be examining this, no matter what it is, whatever the principles are, to think, is this still the best way to negotiate, or should I do things a little bit differently, right? So let me just say, let's talk about the last one, and then I'll stop talking and we can open this up a little bit. So the last step in the process is sort of returning to the table, what I would say smarter and stronger, if I can put it that way. So what does that mean? So there are two ways to return to the table. So, and by the way, when I was trying to find a publisher for the book, um, a number of publishers said this is an interesting idea, but there's one problem. People don't want to read about failure. And I said, really? Because doesn't seem to be my experience. Like, people seem to be kind of interested in this, and we all experience it. So, and they said, yeah, that's lovely, but we don't publish on this. So when I finally found Barrett Kohler, they said to me, look, we get 20 proposals a month on negotiation books, and this is the first time we've seen somebody talk about this. But they said the only advice we have is we've published other books related to leadership and other things that had the word failure in the title. And they said we really don't recommend it, which is why it's called Five Steps to Reviving Negotiations. I was hoping that they said, look, you don't have to change anything inside the book, but we really recommend that you don't use the word failure in the title. I decided to go with that and trust them because they had more expertise on all of this than I did. But and I felt like, as long as I don't have to change the essence of what I'm trying to do here, then okay, that's fine. But when we get to this stage of the and the magnitude of the failure is right, so it's more of a setback, then we want to be thinking, how do I do things differently in a way that was not part of the process before. So I think the first thing, and maybe the hardest part of this, is that somebody has to knock on the door first. And when things don't end well, too often what happens is that nobody wants to knock on the door first. Everybody says, well, the other person was the one that was difficult, so they ought to come back to me and talk to me first. And my advice to folks is this: if Nelson Mandela could spend 27 years in a prison and come out and reach out to Frederick de Klerk, um, and say, and when a journalist asked him, why did you reach out? Like, why didn't you let your captors do it? He said, look, somebody has to knock on the door first. And I've been waiting around a long time for this. And now it's time for, this process to get moving. So, if Nelson Mandela can do it, so can you. Okay. And again, do it for your own purposes, that you can see why it makes sense to restart this process. So the first thing is knock on the door. Don't wait for them. The second is start with them. Where did things break down, right? And what is it about them that you learned in that process that you can now take forward, right? And what ultimately, for example, if you tried to be persuasive and it didn't really seem to work, how can you do that differently? How can you approach things from a different point of view and try it that way, right? Um, and then again, then modify your approach so that you're doing something differently, right? We know the old saying about um, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, right? It doesn't end well. So that's if we can see a clear way back to the table, and much of the time we can. But there are times when we've really failed and we can't imagine how we're going to get back to the table. Maybe it will happen someday, but right now, it's not looking like that. So, how do you really figure out what this looks like? The first is to, again, talk to people around you who can give you a bit of an objective perspective on things. They can help challenge some of your assumptions about what happened. I often call that my negotiation buddy, and I'll reach out to people and say, "Hey, can you help me try to think about what transpired here and what I could have done differently?" The second thing is taking that unlearning seriously. When I started to examine my own approach, I really realized there were certain things that I was doing that I had to stop doing, that were getting in the way. And I think the biggest one was that I was seeing that reaching agreement was the mark of success. And when I was able to move away from that and to start seeing negotiation as about meeting my objective, as best as possible, then I could simply look at something and go, okay, does this proposed agreement really meet my objective as best as possible, or is there another way to think about this? When I started to do that, it really did help me in that way. Then, again, I think in having taught negotiation for quite a long time now, in the neighborhood of about 20 plus years, there are a couple of places where I have seen most people get quite challenged and experience a lot of difficulties. And so I lay out a couple of those around, for example, the concept of uncertainty. For most people, uncertainty is one of those kinds of things that drives us toward certainty, right? There's the old adage, tell me yes, tell me no, but tell me something. And there's a wonderful book. I had an opportunity to interview a woman named Maggie Jackson um, about her book called Uncertain. And in the book, she takes a neurobiological approach to uncertainty, and she actually says that people who learn to sit with uncertainty and really exist in that space, that's actually when your mind is most open to creativity and to thinking differently and to coming up with interesting problems. The challenge for most of us is that it makes us very, very uncomfortable. So, learning to kind of sit with uncertainty and manage it and not feel the need to just rush toward one solution or another is great. The other thing is, learning to be adaptable and flexible. We know when we negotiate, we're always negotiating with incomplete information, right? So we're going to have to adapt. We're going to have to be flexible as part of this process. And so in the book, I talk about some skills of improv that people can try out in an appendix to help them to learn to adapt. When I have students who will say, "I understand why adaptability is important, but I just can't do it," and they say, "So what do I do now?" And I say, "Well, we have to figure out why you can't do it because it's a non-negotiable. Like you've got to learn to do this because you're always going to have things that come up in a negotiation that you didn't expect." And the last thing, and then I'll stop here and we can open things up a bit, is um, there's a Japanese art called kintsugi, and as I was sort of doing research for this, I was like, I feel like what I'm a great metaphor for what I'm trying to get at here. So kintsugi is the art of sort of imperfection, and as you can see with the bowl there, um, when a bowl breaks or something like that, in when you with kintsugi, you're using precious metals like a gold or silver or platinum to um, piece the bowl back together, but not to hide the cracks, to actually emphasize the cracks. because life is about imperfection. And if we can embrace it, um, we're not afraid of it. And I felt like this was such a great metaphor for what I was trying to convey, that we all have our on our sleeves, so to speak. And that's easier in some places than others. I absolutely understand that. But even inside us, if we can understand, hey, I'm not perfect, I'm not going to be. And I can feel these scars as a way of, um, becoming a better negotiator. That's what I should be aiming for. And that each scar helps me to really genuinely learn um, from what's transpired in the past. So let me go ahead and stop sharing, and then kind of open it up and maybe pick up on some of the questions that are that we didn't get to.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And there's been a lot of back and forth on kintsugi and
Uh-huh.
even the
Okay.
notion of wabi sabi, maybe
Uh-huh.
adding to it.
Okay.
I wanted to just see if anybody would like to ask a live question, and maybe even Alex. I thought your question was great because I had the same question. A little cheating with diving into some of the other failures you named in your book. Alex, would you like to start off the open discussion with your question?
Yes, thanks, Nikki. Josh, thanks very much. This has been great. So one of the things that I am curious about is you write about failure number five, which is to actually come to an agreement that happens to be worse than your BATNA.
Hmm.
And I wanted to know what that looked like, actually.
Well, I mean, in theory, we've got our BATNA, right? We know what it is. And so if it doesn't make sense from a negotiation point of view to agree to anything that's, that's worse than your BATNA. And so that's what I was trying to get at and part of it was to help people to really identify their BATNAs. There's still a lot of people who don't. And I think that's one of the why would you agree to something? And people do it all the time. I see it quite a bit. Particularly, for example, when it comes to a job negotiation or salary or things along those lines, when they haven't, a big part of it is that they haven't done a clear BATNA analysis. And in that instance, it's not just about the money, it's about other things. And sometimes we accept jobs because it's with a more prestigious firm or something like that. And that's all well and good if it's important to you. But I've seen people who will actually accept things that are worse than their BATNA and a lot of that has to do with agreement bias. They think that what they're supposed to do is reach agreement. And if they don't, that's a failure. And that's actually the biggest reason why I see people doing that, is they still define success um, as reaching agreement. And so they'll give away things, or they'll um, not stick with what their objective clearly is.
Got it. So it's not that they have a BATNA and decided to go against it or despite it. It's that they never thought about it. And if they had, they wouldn't have made the agreement.
Generally, that's right. That's right. But it's also, yeah, so it is that for sure. But I think it's also being pulled by certain biases, like the agreement bias. I mean, I'm sure you've all had this experience if you teach, where you say to folks, okay, here's a simulation, you have 30 minutes. And when you tell them there's 2 minutes left, there's a mad scramble to reach agreement, right? Even if you tell them, I don't care if you reach agreement. And I always say that because I'm trying to subtly emphasize to them that that's not what this is about. What it's about is you trying to figure out, does it make sense to reach an agreement here or not?
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think that's really tough. And I also think there's an interesting kind of dynamic of those of us who are working as mediators, and then maybe in that process, in that role, kind of driving the process of an underlying negotiation,
Right.
um, and the complexities of that.
And that you're right. And that's hard. As a mediator, if you see a party, like if you can imagine what their BATNA is, or even if they've articulated it, right, and they're willing to accept an agreement that's worse than that, there's sort of an interesting question about whether, it depends on the kind of mediator you are, right? Or if you're very sort of impartial mediator, you might say that's not my job if they want to do this, right? But if you're more of an activist, sort of social justice mediator, you might say, well, maybe we should caucus for a minute and let me just help you think this through a little. Because I mean, and there's a logic to the latter as well, which is part of your job is to help them to come up with what I would call a sustainable agreement, not just any agreement, right? And if you can imagine how that agreement is worse than their BATNA, you know, they're probably going to figure it out. And so helping them in that way is, I think, valuable. And I mean, I would argue, I guess I would say I would probably do that. And I wouldn't necessarily say, I would try to find a way of leading them to their own conclusion there. But again, to me, it's about creating sustainable solutions. That's why, for me, I don't offer up, I think like most people, I don't offer up my own solutions because I know over time they're going to want to agree in the moment. And of course, down the road, it's likely to fall apart because it wasn't their idea and it doesn't really fit their way of thinking.
Yeah, I love that with the kind of useful unlearning. One of the things I remember about my mediation training being a lawyer is you
Mm.
got to unlearn that problem solver or legal knowledge in order to benefit the process sometimes and ensure that you're leading everybody who's engaged you in a sustainable and durable direction.
Yeah.
There was another question about another adage. Do you think that a successful negotiation is when both parties leave the table a little unhappy?
No. Do you want me to elaborate? No,
Sure.
and it's really funny because I had a conversation with somebody actually at the gym that I go to, and so I don't know how we got talking, but I mentioned that, and she said, "Oh, well, exactly that that was her philosophy." And I said, "Well, why do you think that?" And she said, she just stopped for a minute because I don't think anybody had ever really asked her the question. And she said, "You know what? I had a boss who used to say that all the time, and I just adopted it as a mantra." And I said, "Well, like follow the logic through. Um, you know, if that's what you think, then you're going to go into this process thinking about what do I have to give up in order to reach agreement." And I said, there's so much you don't know. The way that I, often talk about compromise is, and I did an article for an interview with Forbes India probably like 5 years ago, and the title of it was "Compromise should be the last stop on the train, not the first." And the point was that you can always compromise. Like if you really feel like it's necessary and critical to do that, okay. But I don't, what I'm trying to do is slow people down. Like people compromise before they even know the parameters of a negotiation or what people care about. And so that's the point that I'm trying to get at. And the other part is no one's ever happy with a compromise. Like it genuinely leaves everybody going, well, I mean, compromise for me, the time when you should compromise is actually when time pressure is of the essence and you need to get something done to keep a process moving. Like that's when I can see compromise being most applicable. But I think people just take that and they apply it to all of these realms, and it really, it's an expedient solution. It's rarely the best one. And I think we can look back at history and it's littered with examples of that. But I also think, by the way, back to the psychological realm, if that's your orientation toward negotiation, that's how you are thinking about everything. And and I think it's a big problem because you're never thinking, well, let's not just come up with the least optimal solution. Like let's find the best one that maximizes value. And you're not going to maximize value if everybody's rushing to figure out what they have to give up without really exploring and understanding and thinking about value broadly, right? Which is what we, I think, help people to do and how we move things from good to great.
Yeah, I think that's a really good identification of one kind of symptom of maybe closed-mindedness or being set in those kind of tracks of thinking or expectations about what negotiating is about. Do you have thoughts about instances where maybe one party is not in negotiating good faith, like they're there, they're not going to budge, they don't want to move, and they've kind of got a one-track mind, and they're there just as a as an obligation, but don't really want to negotiate?
Yeah, I mean, when that's the case, I mean, I definitely try to put some testers out there to gauge their level of commitment. And if it's so for example, and for example, I might say, look, I'm going to share something with you that would be of significant value here for me. But my expectation is that you're going to do the same. And if they don't choose to do the same, then it feels to me like a process where I'm pretty sure that I don't want to continue down that road. I will say, look, if this is not what you want to do, you can let me know. Um, you have my number. I think sometimes you do have to sort of say to folks, like, I'm going to walk away here because this is not in my interest to do this. If you want to change, if you want to, adjust your way of thinking, you have my number. Roger Fisher, who I had the pleasure to get to know, and this is going to be a dating yourself kind of comment. He said, don't be afraid to hang up the phone, but don't cut the wire in the process, right? Now we don't have wires anymore, but the idea is that sometimes you have to say, especially when you feel like people are being disingenuous with the process. And I think, the more you do this, the more you notice that people's words aren't matching their actions. And you have to pay attention to that. And so I think it's important to say, look, I think we could do a lot better if we actually, sort of work together and try to, you know, problem solve this. But if you want to take a much different approach here, then I don't know. I'll have to think about whether I want to go down that road.
Alex, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. I want to pick up on a comment that I read Jonathan here make about mediations and their goals. And I've mediated both in community contexts where there's an expectation of continued relationship, and then in a commercial context where there's
Mm.
a lawsuit pending, and so
Mhm.
the BATNA becomes
Yeah.
expense and trial and so on. And
Yeah.
so in the community piece, I completely agree with you that you need to have a really solid foundation and a real relationship. Otherwise, it doesn't work. What's the point of the agreement? But
Hmm.
in a commercial setting, the commercial training I received and I sort of followed is sort of this idea of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And essentially, you scare the people into talking about the possibility of the costs and the escalation and the risk. And you really
Hmm.
ride that Tversky Kahneman, train, hopefully to an
Yeah.
agreement.
Mm.
And I'm wondering what your view of that is, because I have found myself saying to the parties in a commercial context that I am the advocate of the agreement. I am the agent of the agreement. You have your own agents who are lawyers, and I'm going
Mm.
to advocate for the agreement to the point where part of what sort of my selling point is and why people ask me to mediate is because I hold that space very firmly to help them to get there because they're done. There's no, checks are exchanged. There's no other relationship, and they move on with life. And that in
Yeah.
itself is better. So I'm wondering how you comment on that.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think what you're talking about is the distinction between interest-based and positional negotiation, right? And that if you're in a one-off kind of scenario like you're talking about, where people are not going to be engaging going forward, they need to try to find a solution here, then I think that approach is fine. I think, I think like most folks, where we see this as problematic is when the relationships do matter and people don't recognize that they're going to have to come back to the table. I've had many conversations with folks in the labor management space about the distinction, this distinction and how for so long they would treat each other in that positional way. And then the next time they'd come back to the table, the one side that lost ends up, spending half their time figuring out how they're going to beat the other and not lose again. Right. But if that's not relevant, then I think, you being the purveyor of the agreement per se, I think that makes good sense. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you're really sure that the relationship isn't going to play a role in the future. I think that's the big one. And I see sometimes where people are pretty sure that's the case, and it turns out that it's not. Um, and the other part is also the reputational factor, right? That you have to be careful because people talk, and if you get a reputation as a really challenging negotiator, even if it was warranted in that instance, I've seen in industries, even though industries can be quote unquote large, where have said to me, "Oh, we would never work with that firm again because this happened and it wasn't a good experience, and why wouldn't they do it again?" But I think to your point, in that case, that makes good sense. I mean, when I'm doing trainings or whatever it is, I think like many of you, the first core determining factor is this a one-off kind of thing or is it a long-term scenario? And you build your structure and how you approach things off of that.
Thank you. Great.
Yeah.
We have about less or 5 minutes or so left. Josh, I wanted to just give you the opportunity to make any kind of closing remarks. I know there's still probably a few or many questions outstanding, but it's been really, really helpful. I think, and one of the other questions that I saw was, is there guidance in the book about how to kind of engage in the postmortem process of figuring out what questions do you ask yourself? And similar, I think, to your conversation with somebody who's really, really thoughtful. If we could all call you, that would be great. In lieu of that, is there any guidance in the book that you give? What kind of questions to ask to try and dig into this process?
Yeah, I mean, I do some of that. It's a little hard, but I try to give people some questions to kind of get themselves started. And I think when they begin to pull things apart, you're going to get into that naturally. It's going to sort of click and make sense. I mean, in terms of, last word, I mean, I think if we can all just embrace the notion that this is part of the deal and that we really need to expect that this is going to happen from time to time. And again, not fall into the trap of just pushing it off, because really, I mean, and I think that woman was right that I spoke to initially that I mentioned, who said, that for her, we learn so much more from our failures. And I think if we can really embrace that, and I know reputations matter and things along those, but even for yourself, I mean, it was funny. I had a failure. There was a job that I was being considered for, and it sort of fell apart in a way that, in hindsight, I realized, and could have been done differently. And I think there was a misunderstanding and other kinds of things. Anyways, it was absolutely a failure. And I remember feeling embarrassed. And I remember talking to a friend of mine. He said, "Let me just say something to you." And he's like, "Don't take this the wrong way, but it's something that he'd learned to do." And he said, when you realize you're not nearly as important as you think you are, and that people have moved on, like their lives are going, and you're the only one that's sitting there with your failure, it's a lot easier to get over it and to say, let me really try to figure out what happened here so I don't do it again. But the rest of the world isn't watching you in the way that most of us imagine. The cycle of the world that we live in, maybe it's a minute or two and people are on to the next thing. And so I think we can all, if we go into this with an air of humility and we say, you know what, these failures have something to teach me, and I'm going to be open to that. And it doesn't say anything about me as a person or me as a negotiator. It just says that this dynamic didn't play out the way that I hoped, and let's try it again or try differently, And I think within this too, and the last thing I'll say is, as you all know, this requires a deep level of resilience. And, I believe that what underpins coping with failure is becoming a resilient negotiator. And those are the kinds of things that make us who we are in the end. So I would encourage folks to embrace that.
Nothing better than a call to resilience. Maria, would you like to close us out?
Yeah, first, thank you, Nikki, for all of the work in the chat and keeping it going. And Josh, you were absolutely inspirational this morning. Thank you so much for a really informative and wonderful presentation. I think you made the strongest case I've heard in a long time for how important it is for us as conflict resolvers to be code switchers. We're always asking for parties to be code switchers. You've got to think differently. But wow, I think you nailed it here this morning on how important it is for us to think out of the box, to be as diverse and as creative as we can be as conflict resolvers. So thank you so much.
No,
And
it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
yes, and see everyone next month. Geraldine Downey, a psychologist from Columbia University, will be our speaker. Look forward to seeing you all in March.
Thank you. See you soon, hopefully.
And thank you, Alex, for joining us as a convener.
I'm going to stop the recording.